Hello, CIS25. In this video, I'm going to talk about Chapter 6 notes. We are going to also go over the assignment. I know it's labeled as Unit 6, but it should be Chapter 6 assignment. We are going to look at file system in the operating system, mostly in Windows. So for the first part of Chapter 6, you are to read page 508 to 553. And in this chapter, it talks about file system. Basically, it's just how the drive is organized to store data. And in Windows, there are different type of file system that you can use for the OS or the operating system, which is used to run applications and manage your hardware resources. So the rule for logical drive is to use drive letter, and that can be whether a hard drive or a solid state drive. And sometimes we can just assign a specific letter, unless by default it would just use the letter drive that is next on the list. So if we already have drive C, which is for our operating system, the next drive that you installed or create on your system is going to be D or E and so on. Now, what we want is we want to look at the efficiency of the data storage and the security of the system based on the type of file system that we are selecting, especially with Windows when it has different types. And in the next part, it talks about how the file system can be in 3 different types. So you can have FAT32. Now the legacy would be FAT16, but in the later operating system like Windows 10, you can use FAT32 or ExFAT, which represents FAT64-bit. For the CD storage, it uses CDFS, which stands for Compact Disk File System. Now, there is also a file system called NTFS, which stands for New Technology File System. This is used with the later Windows operating system. It was created in Windows NT, which was in the 90s, but this particular file system allows you to implement security permissions along with encryption. So therefore, we would use NTFS with Windows 10, Windows Server 2019, and Windows Server 2016. So the later OSs should be using NTFS. Now, the FAT file system, FAT stands for File Allocation Table. If you use FAT32, that is 32-bit file allocation table, which gives you 2 to the 32nd power per drive. So you would have many of the file entries compared to if we're using FAT16 or the older file system that's under FAT. Now on FAT32, each of your unit size is allocated as 8 kilobyte, and that can be stored as large as 16 gigabyte. So in a FAT32 type of file system, the largest partition, the section of the drive that you can create, is 16 gigabyte. The maximum logical partition size is 2 terabyte. So then you are going to look at about 2 trillion bytes. So in a FAT32, what we can use is we can create a partition up to 16 gigabyte. Now the maximum logical partition size is 2 terabyte, which is what you often see in the market today, where you can have a drive that will be as large. Windows can't create a FAT32 partition that's larger than 32 gigabytes. So if you have a 2 terabyte drive, you can only section that in multiple partitions that would accumulate to 2 terabyte. It's not able to create the entire 2 terabyte as one partition, as one section. So keep that in mind when you are getting ready for the A+ certification. You need to make sure you understand the unit size, the maximum partition size for specific file system. In the limitation in the individual files up to 4 gigabyte in size. So if you have a very large file, let's say some type of game or video, then what you would see is that it can only reach 4 gigabyte per individual file. It cannot use file permission, and it does not support journaling and can fix file corruption issues. So when you're trying to do repair disk and you're trying to fix the size in FAT32, it's not able to do that. Therefore, we don't want to use FAT32 for most of our operating system. FAT32 can be formatted for flash drive to store files, but it has its limitation, and so we need to understand that. So in an SD card or a flash memory type of USB, you can use FAT so that way it can be seen in other OSs like Mac OS or Unix or Linux. Now in Linux, it's able to see FAT allocation table. It is compatible in Mac OS, so therefore when you purchase USB flash drive, you often see that it is formatted as FAT. So it is compatible with Windows and other operating systems. So now let's take a look at our assignment. The file type, for the first question, it asks you what file type, what file systems can be used in Windows operating system. So we can say that we can use FAT32, which has this limitation as we discussed, NTFS, ExFAT, and CDFS. And CDFS is used for CD drive or DVD drive. For question number 2, it asks you what is the maximum logical size of the FAT32 drive. That will be 2 terabyte. That's the maximum drive size that you can use with FAT32. For number 3, it asks you what is the FAT32 file system used in USB and flash drive. Because the reason why FAT32 is used in the USB and flash drive is because Linux and Mac OS is compatible with FAT32. Now, for the maximum amount of memory that can be used by FAT32, a 32-bit operating system, is 4 gigabyte. So when you're looking at Windows XP or Windows 7, which are the prior versions to Windows 10, you would see that the maximum section of the drive that we can allocate for the OS is 4 gigabyte as it was 32-bit. Now in Windows 7, we started to transition to 64-bit, in which we can have more entry in the files, which is 2 to the 64 power, which gives you a larger capability, a larger drive capability, so you can partition your OS to be a larger size. So next we're going to talk about ExFAT and drive volume capacity. So in the next section, it goes over ExFAT, which is FAT64. And ExFAT is the file system that's designed to use with mobile devices, especially mobile storage in the devices. And we're able to have a larger drive, like I mentioned. It supports a volume that's larger than 32 gigabyte. Why is that? Because when you write data, it's in binary, so it's 2 base, and if it's 64-bit, we will raise it to the 64 power. So that gives us the larger volume size in the drive itself to use for the OS or files in general. So the maximum volume size for ExFAT is 512 terabyte. So when you buy a drive from the store and what you see is, let's say we buy a 2 terabyte drive, right? It's still under the maximum volume size. So you can format that as FAT64 or NTFS if you're using Windows. So theoretically, Microsoft said that the volume size can be up to 64 zettabytes, and 1 zeta is equal to 1 billion terabyte. So eventually, even if we use this file system, it will last a long time as we would have more storage needs. So the recommended maximum file size increased to 512 terabyte up to 64 zettabyte. And I don't think in the consumer PC, we don't have any kind of file size that will be 512 terabyte. But in the case that we do, it's capable of doing that using this particular file system. It supports what's called the Universal Time Coordinate your UTC date stamp, which is not to a specific region, it's just universal, so that way it would record the file based on how it's written. And ExFAT, you can use ExFAT with Windows 7, Windows 8.1, and Windows 10 and later, which is now we are entering Windows 11. So in the Windows for your workstation or your client system, which are the PCs or the systems that are connecting to the network, we would use workstation OS or client OS. So the workstation OS are Windows 7, Windows 8.1, Windows 10, Windows 11. Now, operating systems can be classified as open source, which is referred to software that is free for download and modify, or closed source, which refer to software that cannot be modified without permission and licensing. So Microsoft Windows operating system is under the closed source, in which vendor requires licensing. So when you purchase operating system, that's considered closed source. When you're able to use free download or an open source operating system like Linux, Ubuntu, or Kali, that will be open source. So for CompTIA A+, we know which Windows versions are going to be closed source, right? Windows 7, 8, 8.1, Windows 10. For Mac OS, it's also a closed source, and Mac OS is used on Apple system. And Mac OS has been released since 2016. It's designed to integrate devices using iOS operating system for the iPhone and Apple TV and Apple Watch. On the MacBook and the iMacs, we would use Mac OS, and there are different nicknames that Apple would use for the build of the operating system, such as we would see so if you simply look at the Mac OS and online, and if you look at the versions, you can see that in the earlier versions, 2000 and prior, you do have Mac OS for your iMacs and your Apple system, and they're labeled with names like Cheetah and Puma and Jaguar and Panther. Those are and then leopard and snow leopard, lion, mountain lion, and so on. In 2016 and later, we would see the iOS that will come into play. But for your current version, what you would see is you would see Big Sur, Catalina, or Monterey is the latest. Monterey is the latest, while that will be an upgrade from Big Sur. So as you can see, there are built Now, Snow Leopard and prior would be 32-bit or lower. And then after Snow Leopard version, which is Mac OS X 10.6, to the later version, that will be 64-bit. And since the end of Catalina, Apple has implemented their own processor. So transition from Intel to their own processor, which uses it is a different architecture, ARM. Then you would see Big Sur and Monterey being used for the later um, change in the architecture. And for Monterey, as you can see, that will be released this month in October 2021. So there are some beta version with that. And then the current, what you see being sold with the iMacs is going to be Big Sur, and or even the older iMacs, and the MacBook is Catalina and you can upgrade. So that gives you a little bit of overview on the Mac OS X. Then you have Linux, and Linux is derived from the Unix operating system. So is Apple Mac OS. You would see some similarity in the Mac OS operating system in that it would have terminal, very similar to a lot of the Linux releases as it stemmed from the Unix. And Apple has changed up the look and feel and the features in the Mac OS, while Linux development has many different releases for different needs. Some are open source, not all are open source. Some are freely available, while the other would be licensed under closed source. So for the Linux, you would see Linux being used for server and your workstation OS. For example, when you're using Ubuntu, like how we created the virtual machine, you have a desktop version and there is also a server version as what you see on the AWS cloud. So therefore, Ubuntu have variations in the type of operating system that you would use in a network environment. Now, sometimes you would see server, like Linux server, being used for web server or even for authentication server, for different things. Now, there are different distros or releases of Ubuntu. Also, there is Mint, Kali, Red Hat, and they have Zeus. And so there are many different type of releases, and even going into CentOS and so on. So Linux have variations, and every release is used a little differently, but they sometimes would be classified under Debian or different type of Linux. So when you use Linux, not all Linux are the same. And so you just want to make sure that you have the appropriate version for a certain need. On your smartphone and tablet, you can use Android, iOS, and Windows had created Windows, formerly mobile, or now Windows IoT. So operating system updates allow you to wirelessly connect to your carrier, your service provider like T-Mobile, Verizon, AT&T. That is slightly different than what you've seen, and it also works with the hardware for the smaller portable devices. Now, the wireless carrier for the network would give you specific updates for Android, iOS, or even Windows if you're using phones or a tablet that's using Windows. So the common tablet that you would see in the environment would be your Microsoft Surface, and that would use the lighter version of your Windows operating system. Sometimes you can also use Windows 10, but Windows 10 IoT is common for the portable device. So Windows Mobile or Windows IoT, you would see that there would have the later version would be Windows 10. It runs mostly like your regular desktop Windows 10, but it does have laptop functionality or portable device functionality. Your Android is built on the Linux kernel. It is an open source software. Google releases Android OS code as an open source, which allows developer to support and modify it and create different applications that are freely available for Android. So Android Open Source Project, AOSP, is commissioned by Google, and the mission is to really maintain and the development of Android. So on the iOS, we talked about how it is rooted in Unix and they have modified it for the need of the Apple system. You also see systems that use Chrome OS, and Chrome OS is designed to be affordable. And Chrome is based on Linux. It's used on Chromebook. It is allowing us to buy inexpensive mobile devices such as laptop. Chrome OS is open source and it is designed to be mostly web-based. So it doesn't have a lot of the heavy-duty hardware like what you've seen in your other type of laptops or devices. So there are specific limitations and concern in the case where if we are looking at operating system, compare open source to closed source, and then the features and the applications that comes with different type of device and operating system. You do see some similarity, but the features are definitely different. So the amount of devices that uses Android and iOS is very high in United States compared to the device that would use Windows operating system. So that number is climbing as you see that more devices that will be available in either Android or iOS. So for the Windows Microsoft version, for the CompTIA objective, you need to know what a BitLocker is. And BitLocker is available in Windows OS. This is used to encrypt data, and that encrypts the hard drive or the storage drive, which adds security. So now encryption, it can also use encrypted file system, which is EFS, and this allows us to encrypt individual file. Windows OS also implemented branch cache, and this was implemented a while back. This is designed to efficiently use the bandwidth when you're connecting to your system remotely, and it stores temporarily the requested data for that remote connection. So it would refer to that every time, so it doesn't require bandwidth to reconnect, re-update that data in the connection process. So going back to our questions for number 5, we can say the maximum ExFAT drive volume capacity is 512 terabyte. That's recommended for the maximum volume size. That's a section of the drive that you can partition. And the theoretical volume size could be up to 64 zettabyte, and that will be 64 billion terabytes. Now for number 6, which Windows operating system supports ExFAT file system? We can say that will be Windows 7, 8.1, Windows 10, and later. For number 7, it asks you to identify 2 proprietary operating system or the closed source operating system. That will be your Windows 10, could be your Mac OS 10.15 Catalina, or Windows 7, or Mac OS 10.14 Mojave, or it could be Mac OS Big Sur. So Big Sur is come after Catalina, so you can take a look at some of the later version by doing some search on the internet as well. For question 8, which Windows operating system is currently available in the recently released Surface Pro, that will be your Windows 10, but as we're currently speaking, that will be Windows 11. But for CompTIA, we would know that it's Windows 10. For number 9, what is the mission behind Android Open Source Project, your AOSP? To really maintain and further develop Android, which is the OS that we would see for other devices outside of your Apple and your Microsoft devices. So if you're using Samsung, LG, and so on, you would see that those would use Android OS, and that uses Linux kernel. For number 10, list 2 types of mobile or tablet operating system. You would have the iOS in Apple, Android in other devices like Samsung, LG, Chrome OS, that would be for your Chromebooks, and then Windows 10 for possibly your Surface tablet. Number 11, what is the primary difference between BitLocker and encrypting file system? So BitLocker is used to encrypt the entire drive, while EFS is used to encrypt individual files and folders. And where can you access that? You would right-click your folder. So for example, if this is my folder, I can right-click the folder, go to Properties, and then I can go to the Advanced option here, and I would be able to utilize the encryption as this. Okay, now that's if my file system supports that. So EFS relies on the NTFS the new technology file system. So if you're using a storage device that does not support NTFS, or it's not formatted as NTFS, you will not have the capability to be able to encrypt. Or if you're using a Windows version that does not have that feature, you would not be able to do that. So it mostly rely on the file system itself. So if you format your drive as FAT32 or ExFAT, it would not be able to support EFS. Now, some versions of Windows 7 did not include BitLocker, and so did Windows 10. So if you have the very basic version for home, you would not be able to use BitLocker, which encrypts the entire drive. So for number 12, we can say that the purpose of branch cache is branch cache feature is in Windows operating system is it allows efficient use of bandwidth for remote client offices. It caches most of the commonly requested data on the client computer so that the bandwidth is not wasted or repetitive data requests. Okay. Now, in number 13, it asks you to take a look at different type of operating system you can use. So it tells you here that coffeeforyou.com is a new startup business that has 10 employees, 2 managers, and the company plans to expand its physical location, 2 additional sites, and 20 employees at each site. You're tasked to assist with the technical expansion of the 2 additional sites. So the type of Windows operating system license that should be used for this company, you can refer to the comparison with Microsoft Business OSs. So if you go to this link, or you can simply search for it, you will find there are different editions for your workstation, okay? And that allows you to compare your workstation system. Now, if I wanted to look at the server operating system, we can take a look at Windows for Business editions. And here on this page, you would see that they are promoting Windows 11. Now you can also search for Windows Server 2019 or 2016, which we touch on in class. So here what we can put is we can put that for most business, we can go with the Pro Workstation or Pro at least. And when you look at the comparison between the Pro for the workstation to the actual Home Edition, which is not used for business, is that you would see that they would have options in the features that is different than your Home Edition. So we would say that we can use Windows Server 2016 or 2019. I think currently most company would go with 2019 as the base. As if they already have 16, they can also upgrade to 2019. If they have 10 employees, 2 managers, and 2 additional sites up to 20 employees. And so when you have 20 plus another 20, which is for 2 additional sites, you would have 40 plus the 10 employee and the 2 managers, that will be 12. So you're looking at about 52. So in this case, you are going to need at least 100 to 200 seats, as the Microsoft really sell them in range in bulk. So then we would need to be under the tier where it would be 100 to 200 seats. In the case that what if we expand our branches and we extend where we would have more employees? And then for 13B, how would you implement the OS installation process on the additional system at the new locations? We can use what's called the network PXE boot or pre-boot execution environment. This allows you to install a boot process to really add the OS image to all the system. So that way you don't have to install it on individual computer. You can use the network to connect all your system together, and we can install the boot process on these systems and then run the installation of the OS all at once. Okay, so next we're going to talk about different types of installation. So here it talks about the boot methods. In the boot process, just a way that we would load the different type of OS files into the RAM of the computer so it becomes functional. Then we can use USB, CD, DVD, eSATA to be able to do that. Or we can connect all the computer to the network and be able to set them up with the boot files. So the method for the boot OS installation would be that you would have some kind of storage to be able to transfer the actual disk image, or you can use network PXE boot in the questions. That's what we have answered. We would use this method to install Windows on one or more systems that would be connected to the network. We would physically connect it to a switch. We would then connect it to the switch to all our branches, and then so other switches, and then we would be able to launch the PXE boot at the ROM. And then your USB eSATA boot, you can put your files on your USB and be able to load that, and we would use the ISO file, and we would want to unpack the ISO so that way it would have the proper boot files that it needs to be able to help us install the OS. Now, you will also need to have some kind of storage drive, as we know that our hard disk drive or our solid state would be where our OS file will be installed. So you make sure that you have to have an internal drive, either HDD or SSD. And you can also create partition on the internal disk. And we did this for Windows servers, so you can see how that's done. For network boot technology was created by Windows. This is used to use this boot server discovery protocol, which is your BSDP, to locate and install operating system file if you're using Windows system. So there are different installation types in Windows environment. You would have the in-place upgrade on the existing version. So let's say if I have Windows 7, I want to upgrade that to Windows 10, I can. You can do a clean install with an empty hard drive. And we can create the partitions on, or we can use the entire drive. We can have a multi-boot, and that just is, we would have multiple versions of the OSs or different OSs on separate partitions. So you would be using the unused disk space to add an additional OS, so that way it will be able to have multi-boot. Now we can also do repair installation, where we would fix a problem that occur on the existing operating system. And that can be referred in Windows 8.1 as refresh and reset, or in Windows 10, that will be a recovery option. So refresh and reset was removed from Windows 10, where reset your PC feature offers simpler reset. So on Windows 10, it will just be refresh and restore. And so make sure that we know that refresh and restore means the same thing as refresh and reset in Windows 8.1. All that is that it allows you to reset the system with the option of keeping personal files. But I highly recommend that you back them up first before you do this, because possibly you could make a mistake and wipe out your files. We can also do unattended installation. That would be remotely connecting to the system to do the installation via the network. We can do the installation options, where we would then, in this option, we would create an image file and we can distribute it across using our network connection. So on the larger scale, like when you're looking at an enterprise or a larger organization, normally they would do unattended installation. And unattended installation, you would use the Microsoft Deployment Kit, your MDT, and this allows you to install Windows 7, 8.1, Windows 10, and Server 2008 Release 2 or newer. That allows you to do one shot all at once from all the system. So MDT creates and updates what's called the unattended XML file, and this allows us to be able to implement the unattended installation in our network. You can refer to the link that's provided in the notes for more information. We can also have what's called an in-place upgrade, and an in-place upgrade, in that we are able to upgrade our old OS. We touched on this previously just now. We don't delete the previous installation, but we would just add new files for the new OSs. And that is often referred to as upgrades only. So we want to be able to upgrade the equivalent or better edition of Windows, but not lower. So what does it mean by this? So if you have Windows 7 Home Edition, you want to go with Windows 10 Home as an upgrade, or Windows 10 Pro. We don't go from Windows 7 Pro back to Windows 10 Home because that reduces the feature and it will disable some of the application that uses that feature. So you want to either equivalent or higher. We also have what's called the clean install. And the clean install simply is a way that we can uh, use a brand new drive to be able to do that. You can also clean out your drive and do the clean install. So when you will be using a drive that requires additional drivers like RAID or third-party host adapter, you would need to make sure that you have those driver in place. But ultimately, we can do a clean install on our drive that doesn't have any kind of OS in existence. So we can clean out our drive and do that or use a brand new drive. So during the installation process, we wanted to perform a clean boot installation on an unused hard drive. We would select the type of Windows edition that we want to use. And so making sure that we want to have it activated. We can also configure our firewall settings so that way if we're using the network connectivity, that's not going to block the system. We will also look at partition type, location, and file system when we did this for the lab. And then whether we want to use password and password hint. And then we want to also look at your product key, time, languages, time zone, and so on. So the installation will walk you through the process on setting that up. The other option that talks about multi-boot installation, where we can do multiple operating system. We can have Windows and Linux. Just that, keep in mind that when you install Windows and Linux on the same drive, you would see that Linux would try to take over. So you got to make sure that you set up your boot appropriately when you installing the Linux edition. But you can definitely have multiple editions of Windows in a multi-boot. Depending on how you what kind of partitions you're using. So back in the day, we would only have 4 OSs on the drive using MBR. So master boot record is the legacy way that we would be able to create the drive volumes for our OSs. So you can have something like Windows 8.1, Windows 10, Windows Server on it. But in the later way that we can partition your GPT, you're allowed to have more boot options. So most people would use dual boot, which means that they would use Windows 10 and like a Linux release like Ubuntu or Kali on their system. So you can do it that way and you can learn how to be able to install. And then we also have a repair options in the installation. This is a way that we can fix the existing operating system in case that it has error. So the step for the repair is listed here. You would need to be accessing it using the administrator account. You would insert the flash drive and run setup exe. You would then download and install update. And so the setup process will run the repair and it will take a while depending on how large of the OS drive that you are working with, right? And sometimes repair might not always work. So we want to also look at options where we will be able to pull the file. So what I would recommend is to use like an external adapter to take the internal drive storage and adapt to it, and then plug that, and it would have a USB connection. And so SATA to USB adapter, they sell that for a minimal cost, about 20 something dollars. And then you would be able to use that to transfer the file to another system on an external hard drive. And then you can wipe out that drive and do the installation. And that's how you can do that. For the remote network installation here, We would need to use the Microsoft Deployment Kit like what we talked about earlier. We would also use some type of image deployment. We would need to clone the disk. So when you create an image, it would have the operating system and the applications that you would need, such as Microsoft Office and other type of application. Then you would capture that image for on a desktop OS and then be able to clone it for other hundreds of systems in the network. A way that we can create images is to use image software such as True Image or this wizard. There are many different ways that you can create an image. Depending on the company, they would prefer a different type of software to be able to create an image and clone your disk. So the challenge when you're doing this, when you're creating the image .img or .iso, is to look at the hardware differences. Not even though it's coming from Dell and you might have 100 systems that looks the same on the outside. Sometimes you might have like different network adapter on the inside or video display adapter that's slightly different on the inside. So want to make sure that we check the hardware specification before we do this. And then we also need to resolve the issues with the same security identifier or your SID. This allows the system to connect to the network and authenticate. So you would need to make sure that you modify the SID so that way it sees the system as individual system, not the same exact system, which creates conflict. So a way that we can overcome this to use SysPrep, which is your system preparation tool, and that allows you to load files and restart the PC so that way it modify the SID individually for the system. It will remove the unique PC information, and so your SID would be different for each single computer in the hundreds of computers in our network. And in the refresh and restore, we would come back to what's called the recovery partition, and this only exists if you create it. So in the case where if you do a backup, you can use that backup to recover from. If you don't have a recovery partition, it's because you never create that partition, that section on the disk that would have the image of your system at a certain stage at the time that you did the backup. So what you want to do is you can go back to that section if you create that to be able to recover from. So it's a really good practice to really set up the recovery option so that way you will be able to do a backup, to restore from your backup. Now for the partition method, you can use MBR or GPT, which is GUID or GUID partition table. And GPT is a way that we can create partitions that's not limited to just 4. On master root record, it's still being used, but it's an old way to create the partitions. So for the master root record, and GPT, we would then refer to how many number of primary that you can create. So by default, Microsoft is going to use your MBR unless you specify if it's using GPT. So there are primary and extended partitions. Extended partitions and logical disk drives are being treated as part of the primary partitions. And it also identifies your disk as either basic disk or dynamic disk. So when you did the installation with our lab, when you create your virtual machine for server, you had told VirtualBox on what you want, whether it's a basic disk or a dynamic disk. Dynamic is going to write across the disk. In basic disk, it would write closer together, but it takes longer to do that. So When you make a section of the drive, that is simply a partition on the disk, and then we can create a partition, a volume, right? That would be bootable by putting in OS to it. And then we can assign the letter to the drive. So on a hard drive that's 1 terabyte, we can cut up the hard drive into 2 partitions. So my analogy for this is like a house. You can cut up many rooms in that house, depending on the type of partitioning table that you would use. So in GPT, I can have hundreds of different rooms, and in MBR, I can have 4 rooms. So then in that case, when we started formatting those drive, making it usable for the OS or to store file, then you would then write the type of file system to that section or that partition of the drive. So first you have to section the drive or the partition, then you can format the drive to make it usable. So analogy for this is like you build your empty house, then you can have room dividers, so section the room, and then you can decorate that room and make it usable. So that would be my analogy. That will be equivalent. For the primary partitions, it can only use one single drive letter, and it can be made active or bootable. In the primary partition, it would, so something like OS, you can make it bootable for your C drive. And in MBR can only hold 4 partitions on that disk. Even if you have 2 terabyte or 100 terabyte, if you're using MBR partition table, you would only be able to section that drive to 4 sections or 4 partitions. In the GPT, you would be able to do more. So in GPT, you can have up to 128 primary partitions. So we can have more sections of that drive or more partitions on that drive if we use GPT. Now for the non-Windows operating system like Linux, you don't need to create the partition for that. You can use the available disk space as you go through the OS to install Linux. It will prompt you with how you can create different sections of the drive for different file system that it uses. So it's different than Windows. Okay, so we only create the partition that we can format and use, and then we can leave the unallocated space for later if we need to. And you should not just use up the whole entire drive for the OS, because in the case where the OS fail, you don't really have your data. So a good efficient way to do this is to cut up the drive into multiple sections. So for example, if I have a 1 terabyte drive, I can section it to 2 parts or create 2 partitions. One is going to be for my OS, and the second is going to be for our data. Now for the extended partitions, that is different than your primary partitions in 2 ways. Extended partitions doesn't get the drive letter. It would just be treated as a logical drive that's linked to the primary. Neither the extended partition nor any drive contains can be bootable, so extended partition cannot be used for OS as it is not bootable, and only one extended partition can be stored on each physical drive. And extended partitions are used only with the MBR drives. So it is not used with GPT. So master boot record supports up to drive size up to 2 terabyte. And in a primary partition occupies 100% of your physical drive capacity. In that case, the way the drive, it would then be used for Windows OS. In the extended partition, when you use your drive capacity, the drive letter can be in the extended partition to store application and data, but not the operating system. So keep in mind that extended partition should never be used for operating system. It is only used for data storage. And it is not bootable, as we talked about that. In the GPT, if you're using the GUID partition table, you can support drive up to 256 terabyte, which we don't really see in the consumer market. And it can have up to 128 primary partitions. Now, GPT is more reliable than MBR because it does what's called the silic redundancy check, which is the CRC. So that way your data is more stable and reliable. GPT provides a standard way for the vendor to create additional partitions, and you can use GPT if you enable it in the UI firmware. So in your BIOS setup or your UEFI, you would then need to enable GPT in order to use GPT. And that can be used for Windows 8.1, 7, and 10. Now, the 32-bit version of Windows can use GPT drive, but you can commonly just set that up in the BIOS or system setup. And when you add that drive, you just need to either create as a partitions, or it could be a secondary or third or multiple drive. Now, dynamic and basic disk, we saw this when we did the lab, but for the dynamic disk, it would be more versatile to compare to the basic disk. So the advantage of that is that it's able to write quicker. On a single logical drive, you would then be able to write across the drive. On the RAID drive, like how you would stripe or mirror, dynamic disk would give you a faster or better performance. So on the basic disk is usually only bootable disk. So when you're looking at your C drive, this is where you would see it labeled as basic. So here it gives you the screen capture on when you create the partition, and then you would go through and you would look at different type of partition, and as we saw this in the lab. For the NTFS, the new technology file system, it is different than your FAT32 or ExFAT in that you're able to implement access control through the security tab. So you can add users and groups and be able to assign permissions. You can also have compression capability where you would be able to compress the files of the folder. And that uses the built-in compression file format. So you can make it a .zip, or you can just make it the compression .zip. So then unlike FAT32, NTFS use a separate recycle bin for each of the users, so each of the user can empty their recycle bin to free up the drive space. Now, we talked about encryption, and encryption is implemented in NTFS using EFS. So if you don't have NTFS file system on the drive, you will not have EFS capability or encrypting file system capability. It also allows you to mount a drive that enable for your removable media like your USB or external hard drive. It also allows you to control the storage by setting up disk quota. So for example, if I have a drive that's 50 gig and I can set the disk quota to be 40 gigs, so the user can only store up to 40 gigs, and it can also give the user warning when that user exceed that particular or close to exceed that particular drive space. It also allows hot swapping, and hot swapping is what you see with drives that are connected. So that means that removable media formatted with NTFS can be connected and removed while your operating system is running, and you don't need to shut it down. It also uses indexing, which helps the user to quickly search use the search tool in the File Explorer to be able to locate the file. So the way that you can do this is through your Windows Explorer or your File Explorer. And this will allow you to see what type of file system you have, what type of drive you have. You can also use disk management to take a look at your file system. In Linux or sometimes in Windows operating system, you would see there's a swap space, and swap partition is formatted using extra RAM, so that way you don't need to buy additional storage. This allows us to implement what's called a virtual memory to be able to access a certain disk space. So you often see when you're formatting partitions or drive for Linux, it will ask for the swap space on the disk, and it treats it as a virtual memory. But you don't use it as a storage. It's just a way that we can access a certain disk space that will be partitioned. Now, in quick formatting compared to full formatting is that it would, on the brand new drive or existing drive, you can use quick formatting to quickly clear the area of the hard drive, or you can use full format to rewrite the disk and the disk structure across the entire disk surface. So quick format will write everything to the entire capacity of the disk, where if you want, and you can use the full format with that. Full format, it must rewrite the disk structure across the entire disk, as in a full disk. And so you can select different type of format when you right click the drive and be able to choose format and choose the type of format that you want. So let's answer the questions from our assignment. For 13C, the type of installation that is needed for additional operating system at the new sites, we can do the clean installation. And clean installation on the new computers, that will be, it doesn't have any kind of OS on it, so we would then do the clean installation. Now for 14, the purpose of Microsoft Deployment Toolkit is that it's used for the unattended installation for Windows 10. It creates what's called the unattended XML file, and it would automatically use that file for deployment. So this allows us to have the automation in the installation itself on the network when all the systems are connected. We would download the MDT from Microsoft Link and then use it to create, and we also use a different software to create the system image. In Windows 7, it uses what's called Windows System Image Manager instead of MDT, and that would allow you to create the unattended XML file. So in Windows 7, it's slightly different than Windows 10, in that Windows 10 uses MDT and Windows 7 uses the Windows System Image Manager. For 15, a client has Windows 7 32-bit operating system installed on the desktop computer. He asks you to help him upgrade the computer to a newer operating system. You would use the operating system to upgrade. That will be 32-bit Windows Home Edition. And the upgrade needs to be equivalent or higher, as we discussed. For 15B, if the client wishes to select the operating system with the features for the business application, what is your recommendation? We can go with an upgrade for 32-bit Windows 10 Pro, which is a higher upgrade. If possible, we can also upgrade the processor to 64-bit so it will perform better, and you can have larger drive capacity. For 16, you are tasked to complete the remote network installation of Windows 10. A, what tools do you need for the image deployment? We can use Acronis True Image or Seagate Disk Wizard. And with the True Image, or Seagate actually built their Disk Wizard through Acronis True Image, we would create a disk image which contains the OS and the application, and we will clone that for all the systems that would need the exact same thing. For 16B, what preparation process do you need before you begin the image deployment? You would then create this image, store it on the network drive. We can then assess hardware differences using sysprep to prepare the unique SID instead of using the same exact SID for the image across, which creates problem. So sysprep gives us unique SID for different system. 17, a client asks you to restore her Windows 10 system. A, how do you begin this process? You can go to Settings, click on Recovery, and get started under Reset this PC. Now for B, what reset option do you select if the client wishes to save her personal file? You simply select the option, select Keep My File option. So Keep My File options is going to keep the files intact, but as I mentioned, you need to make sure that you also duplicate that file as copy it to an external hard drive just in case something happens. For 18, how many primary partitions can be created using MBR or GPT? For a master boot record MBR, you can create 4 primary partitions and 1 active partition with OS. For GPT, you can create up to 128 primary partitions. For 19, how many extended partitions can be stored on the physical drive? That would only be 1 extended partition per drive if you're using MBR. For 20, what is the different features in NTFS in comparison to FAT32 file system on Windows OS? We talked about how NTFS allows you to have access control, which present the permissions capability to control users and group that access certain files, folders, or objects on that system. It also allow you to compress, or it has built-in compression. It provides individual user recycle bin. It also supports encrypting file system. When you click the properties of the files of the folder, you can go to the advanced option and be able to do that if the version you have or the file system you have is there, which is NTFS. Support mounting of a drive like USB, flash drive, external drive, and also internal drive if that drive is made available through BIOS or UEFI. We also can set up disk quota to control storage limitation for each of the user. We can also have hot swapping where we don't need to shut down the operating system to be able to access the drive or switch the drive. And we can use indexing where we can search quickly for a certain file or file type. 21, describe the functionality of swap partition. Swap partition is a disk space partition that is available in case extra RAM is needed. So it uses the disk space as RAM, and this is what's called the virtual memory. So Windows Hot Swap is available along with Linux, also use swap space. Swap partition is formatted to use extra RAM, but it cannot be used as regular storage. For 22, you're helping a friend installing Windows 10 on the newly built PC. What type of disk formatting should you choose during this installation process? You can use quick format because the computer has new hard drive. And that use the entire capacity of the drive. Unless you want to specify, then you can go to the advanced option, create the partition first, and then you can format. 23, in Windows 8.1, how do you open command prompt? We would use command prompt by using Windows X key, or you can search for CMD or command prompt. But in Windows 8.1, you can use Windows X key and then select command prompt. All that is going to open up the application that would be available and you can find it. 24, Now we're going to touch on different type of commands in command prompt, and I know in the lab we've been doing this. So after the section on the drive and the type of partitions, there is a section on workgroup and domain setup when you do the installation. So workgroup, it is just a system that would be part of the workgroup, which are peers. So in your normal environment, you would have workgroup unless you have a domain controller, which is a server, and that will be your DNS. You can you can set up that system to join a certain DNS. In Windows Home Network and small office networks used in workgroups, Windows 7 and newer would then belong to what's called home group. You can supply the network information and allow the system to log on to the network as needed. When you first install your OS, you need to set up time, date, region, language that allows you to have the operating system use in certain location with certain language, like English in United States, but we also need to install drivers, software, and updates. So especially when you have the brand new OS, you need to install chipset driver, which is for your motherboard, and you would go to the manufacturer website to be able to download that and install it as a package. The reason why is that a lot of the newer system uses onboard devices like video adapter, network interface card. And when you're relying on Windows OS driver, what happens is the generic driver doesn't always have all the additional features. So you might not have the resolution that you need, or it might not reach its full capacity. So you always want to use manufacturer driver, especially when you deal with motherboard or any kind of adapter that you install as a hardware. You should also create a system restore disk. Sometimes companies would release the factory reset disk where you can obtain, or mostly now download. You can put it on your USB and keep that as a backup. So I normally tell the client that after I fix the system that I will create a recovery disk for them. And so in the case that they need to, they can use it to fix the problem. So the compatibility with the OS is important. We wanted to look at the hardware and the prerequisite. So for Windows 10, we know that we need to have a processor that's 1 gigahertz or faster, or your system on chip, your SoC. We need to have at least 1 gigabyte of RAM. That's going to be very slow, but the more RAM you have, the better, especially when we deal with application that needs RAM. So for the 32-bit OS, you only need 1 gigabyte of RAM. On the 64-bit of OS, the minimum is going to be 2 gigabyte. So we can go with something higher. 16 gigabyte on the 32-bit OS or 32 gigabyte on 64-bit OS would be ideal, but sometimes we can also use 16 gigabyte on 64-bit, which is fine. So like the laptop I'm using now uses 16 gigabyte on the 64-bit OS. Your graphic adapter needs to support DirectX or later with the WDDM 1.0 driver. So making sure that that adapter is capable of doing that. And your display needs to be 800 by 600 resolution. So if you're using an older display, you just got to make sure that you check the spec for that display. And we want to have internet connection for updates and installations and possibly downloading the files that we need for driver. So that means that we have to have wireless adapter and network interface card. So compatibility, Microsoft provides a compatibility checker. It checks your hardware, which goes through the hardware compatibility list, and it will tell you whether you can upgrade or not. It also look at the product list against your Windows catalog or Windows logo product list. In Windows 7, that will be those things, and hardware compatibility list exists in Windows 10. So if we plan to upgrade from 10 to 11, we also need to check what Windows 11 require, pretty close to Windows 10, and we want to be able to see if we can upgrade. And before you perform any kind of upgrade, just make sure you back up all your files. For command line, we can search for CMD by doing command prompt CMD like this. Okay, in the older Windows, here you can see that you can use Windows X, which is now opening up PowerShell. In Windows 10, it's slightly different than Windows 8.1. Now, if you right-click your Windows button, you can use the Run option, and that you can type in CMD, and that should also open up your command prompt. So we want to know how to be able to execute command prompt or cmd.exe. And here gives you a list of different type of command. So in the past, in the lab, we have done dir, we have done change directory, which allows you to move from one folder to the next. We can do cd ... which brings me back to the previous folder or move one step back. We can use ipconfig to be able to look up our IP address. We can use ping to see if a system is connected. We can use traceroute to be able to follow a certain packet, meaning a certain type of traffic from your system to the destination. So what I can do is I can do a traceroute www.google.com, and that will follow the traffic from my computer to Google Web Server. And with that, what we can see is we can see how many routers that it would go through. So it would list the number of hops and which router that would be. We can also look at our active TCP connection, which is using netstat. So in the troubleshooting for network connectivity, you would first need to see if that system is alive. And we can do a ping 127.0.0.1, which is a loopback address. This allows us to check to see if ourselves, the host, is alive. And so here it tells me that it sent 4 requests and it received 4 replies, 0 loss. That means it is connected. You can also look at how you can find a certain DNS by doing NS lookup and then shut down, usually just shut down the computer. So after we ping our system, we can also look at the IP address using ipconfig or ipconfig/all, which gives you more details. And that will tell you the IP address, the DHCP, and the DNS information on your network. And so we would then we have done checklist, we have done SFC. Now you can kill a task or end it, that will be equivalent to the end task if you're looking at a certain task. So in the case where if you have a hanging task and it's not responding, you can do task kill. That will be just the same as using end task. So we will have more practice on command prompt in the later weeks for our lab. Now, GP update allows you to do an update of your group policy. So what do we mean by group policy? So group policy allows you to control different type of users, groups, and objects that's in Active Directory, which is a role that Windows uses to manage all of the user groups and objects. Think of it like a database where it contains all the users, the groups, and so on. So when you modify what those groups are allowed to do, you can force it to update across your network by doing GP update. And GP result gives you the resultant set of policy that would specify for a certain user. So we can take a look at what type of users, what type of groups would have a certain type of policy that will be applied. And we can format a drive, we can do a copy, and then in the robocopy, that's different, where it would be able to copy or move files and folder that can be configured in optional GUIs. So you can do a robocopy, and Xcopy is different than regular copy in that we can move it to a different drive. So when you right click and copy a certain set of folders and file, in the back you would see that the system would use a certain command to execute that, and so you can see that will be the difference here. Now for the net use or the net use just to connect you to a shared folder on the network that will be mapped to a certain network drive, or net user that would be managing the user's account by adding or removing that user. We don't remove the user in the case that they are fired. We disable that user because we might need the files and folders that's attached to that user account. So when the person it has left the company, we want to disable that user account in case we need it. And then down the line, you can remove that user after you have pulled their files and things that you need, but we keep it for a while just for audit purposes. Okay, so here walks you through all the commands that I've talked about. I suggest that you practice the commands and understand what each of the command does, because CompTIA will ask you for a specific command in command prompt for Windows, and command prompt for Windows is different than Linux command line, as we've seen that when we practice using Linux virtual machines. Okay, so check out each of the command, understand each one you can use, and practice each one. And anytime that you don't know a command, you can always do question mark or /help. That will allow you to access. So we can do ipconfig, okay, help, and it will give you the options in that. So for your operating system tool, your operating system tools are here, and I think we touched on some of the utility, and we will do more with the system administrative tools later on when we work on the future lab. Like we can schedule a certain service, we can check performance monitor, we can look at memory diagnostic tool. I think we've done that in the past, and then we can also look at firewall settings and event viewer and so on. So event viewer, it allows you to see the events that's been tracked and stored. So that is commonly used in security area. And we have used this management, and I will touch on your Microsoft Management Console in the future lab. So now we just need to answer the rest of our questions. For number 24 in command prompt, identify the commands for the following tasks. Display TCP/IP network information on the device. We would use ipconfig. To scan C drive or errors and repairs them, that will be your check this and then drive C. To stop Notepad .exe on the local or remote computer, you can do task kill img notepad.exe. So that is going to stop that executable. You can do an add user. A Mendoza password is that type of password. So you would do net user A Mendoza and then the password, and then click and type add after the password. You can format a drive, format F drive using NTFS. We would do a format drive letter /FS for file system NTFS. We would be listing existing hard drive by doing this part and then enter list disk or list volume, and I think we've done that previously. For 25, identify 3 Windows administrative tools, and you can refer to the last part of the notes for this. For computer maintenance, we can use Computer Management Console that allows us to look at users, also looking at disk management that will be linked with it, events, and so on. We can use Local Security Policy Performance Monitor. That's going to look at the security settings and the performance of your system. You can, this should be a separate thing. You can look at service system configuration by looking up services, and that would list all the services which is available in your system, whether it's enabled, disabled, or you can stop a certain service that has been started. We can look at task scheduler, so we can schedule a certain task, like how your antivirus application, it uses a task scheduler, but you can set up where at a certain time in the day it would be able to do certain tasks using task scheduler. We can look at print management windows to look at what's in queue or what's pending or what has been printed. And then we can look at memory diagnostic, where we would check our memory to see if there's any kind of issues with our memory or any kind of error. And diagnostic can be done at the boot up, or and usually that's what it wants, because your memory is going to be in use, so it won't allow you to do that while your applications are running and your OS is running. So out of all the 25 questions we have touched on in this chapter, we mainly focus on our operating system, different type, partitions, file systems, and then the utility and the tools. So make sure that we cover all of the little details so that way you can prepare for your CompTIA A+. And thank you for watching this video. This concludes my Unit 9 lecture. And along with the notes and the assignments we have gone over